Picture this, tens of thousands gathered, packed shoulder to shoulder, a city holding its breath. Drums rolled like thunder. The guillotine stood tall, its blade glinting coldly in the pale winter light. A man approached, slowly, heavily, not with the grace of royalty, but with the gait of a prisoner. His hair had been cut, his hands were bound. Gone were the silk coats, the powdered wigs, the golden sceptres. Gone was the divine right of kings. What stood before the people now was no longer Louis XVI, King of France and Navarre. He was Louis Capet, citizen, convict, condemned. He stepped onto the scaffold. The priest muttered Latin prayers. The executioner moved quickly, mechanically, with the detachment of someone sharpening a tool. Louis raised his voice, once, twice, but the drummers drowned him out. He tried again. I die innocent, but the command had been given. Drown him out. And then he looked up. For a moment the crowd saw not a tyrant, not a symbol of a broken regime, but a man, pale, human, terrified. The blade paused above his neck. It held for a second, not by hesitation, not by mercy, but by the physics of death and steel. That breathless pause, where the whole of monarchy, revolution, and justice seemed suspended, would become the most defining second in French history. It would be easy to begin the story here, with the roar of the crowd, the fall of the blade, and the fountain of royal blood that followed. But that moment didn't arrive by accident. It was built brick by brick, mistake by mistake, in palaces and prisons, in speeches and silences, over years of war, hunger, betrayal, and rage. Before the blade ever fell, there was a boy crowned too young, a kingdom teetering, and a people who had been starving too long to be patient. Before the man lost his head, he had already lost his throne, his power, his name, and slowly his country's mercy. To understand why Louis XVI died to the sound of cheers, we have to go back to a world where kings were gods, queens were foreign, and the people were beginning to dream of fire. He was never meant to lead a revolution. In truth, he was barely meant to lead at all. Louis Auguste came into the world as a second son, awkward, shy, heavy-set, the kind of boy who avoided eye contact, who stuttered when nervous, who preferred locksmithing over politics. His older brother was groomed for kingship. Louis was groomed for nothing. But when smallpox took the elder heir, destiny abruptly changed course. At just 11 years old, Louis became Dauphin, the next king of France. He would inherit a kingdom gilded in gold, but rotting at the core. The France of Louis XVI was a nation of paradoxes, glittering balls in Versailles while peasants ate bark, silken nobility twirling through chandeliers, while entire provinces drowned in debt. It was a monarchy built on splendour and denial, an ancient order cracking beneath the weight of centuries. Louis married young. At 15 he was paired with Marie Antoinette, an Austrian archduchess with powdered hair, foreign blood, and no concept of hunger. Their wedding was a political alliance meant to ease tensions between Austria and France, but for the people, it only stoked resentment. To them, she was the foreigner who gambled fortunes while French mothers buried their children. And Louis was the boy who did nothing to stop her. In private, he was mild, perhaps even kind, but kings cannot afford kindness without strength. And Louis had no instinct for power. He avoided confrontation, delegated decisions, and when forced to choose, hesitated until the choice was made for him. The court called it humility. The streets called it weakness. As bread prices soared and riots flared, Louis retreated deeper into distraction. He tinkered with locks in his workshop, obsessed over mechanical gadgets, and buried himself in books on ancient kings. He was a man trying to understand power by reading about it, rather than wielding it, all while his people cried out in hunger. He introduced reforms, yes, but they came too late, and always too softly. He summoned the Estates General in 1789, the first in 175 years, but did not grasp what he had unleashed. The people, once given a voice, refused to be silenced. Louis, baffled by their fury, tried to stand above the fray, as if neutrality could save him. But in revolution, there is no neutral ground. There is only before the fall and after. The monarchy he had inherited demanded spectacle, demanded certainty. But Louis offered neither. Where kings were supposed to command, he compromised. Where they were expected to inspire fear, he inspired confusion. And slowly, what little authority he had began to dissolve, not with a bang, but with a shrug. As the storm gathered outside the palace gates, the king at the centre remained oddly still. He was not a tyrant, he was not a villain. He was something far more dangerous in a moment of fire. He was indecisive. And in the growing shadow of that indecision, the crowd began to gather its courage. The streets started to whisper, louder and louder, not just about hunger, not just about taxes, but about the crown itself, about whether France needed a king at all. The whisper became a roar. In Paris, the air itself seemed to crackle with fury, not the kind that passes in a moment, but the kind that lingers, builds, sharpens its knives. It wasn't just hunger anymore, it was humiliation. In salons and slums alike, the people spoke of rights, of liberty, of something new. The old world had been exposed, dripping with privilege, indifferent to pain, and the people, for the first time in centuries, dared to ask why. France was on the edge, not just of revolt, but of reinvention. And what terrified the monarchy most was that the idea had become contagious. The Estates General had been called in desperation, a move by Louis to ease the pressure valve. But instead of controlling the fire, he'd poured oil on it. The Third Estate, the commoners, realised they were the nation's spine, not its footstool. They broke away, declared themselves the National Assembly. Locked out of the meeting hall, they gathered in a nearby tennis court and swore an oath that would echo through time. They would not disband until France had a constitution. Louis watched from behind gilded walls, bewildered. To him, this was chaos, but to the people, it was clarity. A new France was being born, and the king didn't understand the language of its labour. Outside Versailles, food riots erupted. Bread lines turned into battlegrounds, tax offices burned. The Bastille, a crumbling medieval fortress that held barely any prisoners, became the perfect symbol. On July 14th, 1789, the people stormed it. They weren't after what was inside, they were after what it represented. Tyranny, silence, iron bars. When they took it, they took more than a building. They took history by the throat. And it wasn't just Paris. The countryside erupted in what became known as the Great Fear. Peasants, long buried beneath generations of nobility, rose up and turned on their lords. Manor houses went up in flames. Feudal records were destroyed. The very documents that bound them to servitude vanished in the smoke. The National Assembly, desperate to contain the chaos, abolished feudal privileges. They issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a bold, idealistic document that declared liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression as sacred rights. But behind every paragraph was the looming question, what of the king? Louis, cornered, tried to adapt. He wore the revolutionary cockade. He smiled for the crowds. But the people could see the sweat behind the crown. He had not changed. He was simply pretending to understand. And in a revolution, pretense is a death sentence. The centre was collapsing. Royalists and moderates clashed with Jacobins and sans-culottes. The language of the street grew sharper. Guillotine, treason, republic. The monarchy no longer seemed sacred, it seemed absurd. And all the while, Louis hesitated. He still believed in divine right, in ceremony, in hierarchy. But those beliefs had become fossils in a world that now moved with terrifying speed. He was a king, stranded in the wrong century, a monarch staring down a mob, still hoping for applause. And so, behind palace walls, he began to consider the unthinkable. Not how to rule his people, but how to escape them. The palace had once been the centre of the world, Versailles, built to awe, to dominate, to separate kings from the chaos of the common, stood like a monument to divine monarchy. Gilded mirrors, endless corridors, fountains that sang in perfect symmetry. It was not just a home, it was an illusion, one that had worked for generations, but illusions crack when people are starving. By October of 1789, the illusion had shattered. The women moved first. They came not with speeches, but with hunger. Thousands of them, mothers, widows, daughters, marching through rain and mud, their feet blistered and bloodied, their arms carrying not protest signs, but kitchen knives and hatchet. They wanted bread. They demanded justice, and they would go to the gates of the Sun King's palace to get it. What began as a market riot in Paris over the cost of flour It quickly became a pilgrimage of desperation and fury. As word spread, men joined too, many from the National Guard, some led by a young and reluctant officer named Lafayette. By the time the columns reached Versailles, it was no longer a protest, it was a siege. Inside, Louis was paralysed. He had never seen his people up close, not like this, not soaked from rain, teeth chattering from rage and cold, eyes alight with a kind of holy vengeance. These were not courtiers or subjects, they were survivors, and they had come to bring the king to heel. That night the palace groaned under the weight of uncertainty. The guards doubled their posts, the gates were shut, but everyone inside knew Versailles was not a fortress, it was a dream, and the mob was reality knocking at its marble doors. In the early hours of October 6th, the doors broke. They came through the gates like a tide with no moon to restrain it. At first it was the sound, boots and bare feet pounding the flagstones, a wall of screams and clanging metal echoing down the gilded halls. Then the blood came. The king's Swiss guards, outnumbered and half asleep, were overwhelmed in minutes. One was decapitated, his severed head paraded on a pike through the Queen's courtyard, as if to answer centuries of royal detachment with one brutal image. This is what it means when the people finally arrive. Marie Antoinette barely escaped. Awoken in the middle of the night, she fled barefoot through a secret corridor to the king's chambers as the crowd surged toward her door. They wanted her especially, the foreign queen, the Austrian whore, the symbol of everything wrong with France. That she survived at all was an accident of architecture. By dawn, the palace no longer belonged to the monarchy. The mob flooded the gardens, the staircases, the salons, once designed for elegance and distance. Women danced on marble floors. Men urinated in golden vases. Versailles, the carefully staged theatre of absolute rule, had been reduced to a stage set ripped apart by the actors who had long been forced to sit in the dark. But they had not come to destroy it entirely. They had come to capture the story and rewrite it. The demand was simple. The king must come to Paris. He must leave this palace of mirrors and walk among the people. And to everyone's shock, he agreed. Not because he had found courage, but because he had run out of option. And so, on October 6, 1789, Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette and their children emerged from Versailles not as rulers, but as prisoners of public opinion. Their carriage rolled slowly behind the mob, surrounded by men with muskets and women with butcher knives, some still holding loaves of bread high in triumph. On the front of the procession, a severed head bounced gently each step. Versailles faded behind them, a golden corpse bathed in sunlight as the royal family entered Paris, like a funeral march in reverse. The city did not cheer, it stared. The monarchy, once too distant to touch, was now close enough to smell. The palace they gave him was called the Tuileries. It had once been a place of quiet elegance, tucked between the Seine and the gardens. Now it was a gilded prison. The velvet was fading, the mirrors were cracked, and the rooms echoed with the shuffle of guards' boots rather than the whispers of courtiers. Louis XVI no longer woke to the sound of harpsichords or the rustle of silks. He woke to shouted demands outside his windows. Bread, justice, liberty. The slogans changed, but the rage remained. The king was no longer a divine figure. He was a man with a locked door and a shrinking circle of power. He still signed documents, still gave decrees, still sat beneath the fleur-de-lis when ministers came to speak with him. But everyone knew the illusion was wearing thin. The people no longer believed in his voice. The assembly no longer feared his disapproval. The guards no longer saluted with sincerity. He was a king in name only, a monarch trapped in a city that was unmaking monarchy. He tried at first to cooperate, to become a constitutional ruler, as the revolutionaries demanded. He wore the tricolour cockade on his hat. He accepted the Declaration of the Rights of Man with careful nods and empty words. But inside, he despised it. The idea of being equal to his subjects, of being questioned, voted on, constrained, it was not in his blood. He had not been raised for this world. And worse, he was afraid. He saw what was happening to the nobility, the arrests, the trials, the mobs that broke into private homes looking for royalists. He read the pamphlets, those grotesque depictions of his wife as a foreign harlot, of himself as a bloated coward, of his son as a weakling born to fall. He watched, helpless, as everything sacred to the old order was dragged into the street and pissed on. But the public, still unsure whether to execute or preserve him, gave him a role to play, the captive symbol. They put his face on new coins, not out of loyalty, but to remind the people who was now beneath them. They kept him under watch, not just to prevent escape, but to force him to live the humiliation. Every meal he ate was prepared under supervision. Every letter he sent was read. Every decision he made had to pass through hands that did not respect him. In private, he wrote in his diary, mostly single words. Nothing happened. Walked in the garden, slept poorly, as if he could shrink himself to invisibility. But the city would not let him disappear. Outside the palace gates, the revolution deepened. The assembly passed new laws. The guillotine was raised. Crowds grew larger. Soldiers grew more radical. And Louis knew the day would come when submission would no longer be enough. He began to plan, not for compromise, but for escape. He had once been Louis XVI, King of France and Navarre, anointed with holy oil and crowned beneath the soaring vaults of Reims Cathedral. But by December of 1792, he was no longer a monarch, not even in name. The National Convention referred to him simply as Louis Capet, dragging his lineage down from the throne to the grave. The title was deliberate, chosen to sever his divine claim, to reduce him to a common citizen whose fate would be decided not by blood, but by law. The trial was held in the Salle du Manège, the former royal riding school turned revolutionary courtroom. It was packed with deputies, each a knife blade of opinion, all sharpened by months of fear, propaganda, and rage. There were no jurors, no defence counsel in the modern sense, just a political theatre dressed in the language of justice. Louis sat behind a wooden barrier, flanked by guards, pale and heavy, his once grand features sagging under the weight of weeks in captivity. He spoke with dignity, slow, careful, almost fatherly, but few were listening for truth. They were listening for guilt, for confession, for a justification to kill a king and still call it justice. The charges were not unexpected: conspiring against liberty, inciting civil war, colluding with foreign enemies. The mountain of evidence included letters to Austria, intercepted documents, the infamous iron chest discovered in the Tuileries, filled with correspondence, proving his betrayal of the revolution. Some of the letters bore his own handwriting, others showed his seal, a fleur-de-lis pressed into wax, now dripping with implication. He denied none of it, not out of arrogance, but out of helplessness. He had tried to flee. He had asked for foreign armies to intervene. He had undermined the revolution at every turn. But in his eyes, these were not crimes. He had acted, as any king would, to protect the sanctity of the throne. That was the tragedy. Louis could not conceive of treason from above. To him it was the revolution that had rebelled. He had only resisted. But the men judging him were not interested in royal logic. They had watched friends dragged to the guillotine, had seen cities burn, had stood before mobs demanding blood. They could not afford sentiment. Robespierre, cold as flint, declared that Louis must die so that the revolution may live. The vote came not for guilt. He was declared guilty, nearly unanimously, but for death. One by one, over 700 deputies stood and cast their voices into history, some with thunderous certainty, others trembling, some wept, some shouted, some whispered the sentence, as if speaking it aloud was too heavy for their conscience. Death, death, death. A narrow margin, 361 to 360, decided it. By a single vote, the former King of France was condemned to die. Louis heard the verdict with composure. He asked only for three things: time to prepare, a confessor to accompany him, and to be executed not like a criminal, but as a soldier, by firing squad. The convention denied the last. He would die like the rest, beneath the guillotine, in public, before the same crowd that once shouted, "Vive le roi!" He spent his last night writing farewell letters, most of which were confiscated and never delivered. He embraced his son and daughter. He told them to forgive, that he bore no hatred, that he died innocent, that he would pray for France. And outside, as dawn crept into Paris, the scaffold was being prepared. It was a cold January morning in 1793, and the streets of Paris trembled with anticipation. News had spread like wildfire through the cafes and printing presses. Louis Capet, once King of France, would be executed by guillotine. No appeals, no final debate. The National Convention had spoken, and now the blade would answer. The sentence, though uttered by votes, had carried the weight of centuries. France had never seen such a spectacle. Kings had died in wars, fallen in palace intrigues, vanished into exile. But never like this. Never stripped of all ceremony, marched through the streets like a prisoner, and offered up to the people as a sacrifice. The revolution had promised liberty and equality, but what it now demanded was blood. The night before his death, Louis slept little. He spent hours with the priest, Abbé Edgeworth, in prayer and reflection. He wrote to his wife, Marie Antoinette, a letter that the convention would never let her read. His children slept unaware in their locked chambers, guarded by men who once bowed to him. His last hours were marked not by rage or fear, but by something quieter, something tragic, a resignation that the world he had been born to rule no longer existed. At dawn they came for him. 4 guards entered his cell. They informed him that the time had come. He nodded. He rose. He dressed in white, simple, clean, without a crown or robe. As he stepped out of the temple prison, he turned to Edgeworth and said, "Let us go, sir. It is time to fulfill our destiny." The cart that awaited him was open, deliberate in its exposure. The ride was slow, not because of traffic, but because it was designed to be seen. He passed through streets packed with citizens, past soldiers whose bayonets were turned toward the crowd, not toward the prisoner. A wall of silence followed him. Some watched in awe, others with horror, some with tears, and others with nothing but cold indifference. The man once known as the most Christian king was now just a man on his way to die. They reached the Place de la Révolution, formerly Place Louis XV. It was here, under a grey sky and beside the Statue of Liberty, that the scaffold rose like a wooden altar. Drums thundered to drown out his final words. He tried to speak to the crowd. He began, "I die innocent of all the crimes imputed to me. I pardon those who have occasioned my death." But the drummers were ordered to beat louder. His voice disappeared beneath the noise. He removed his coat. He climbed the stairs. His hands were bound. He struggled against it, saying it was not fitting for a king. But Edgeworth whispered, "Sire, in this moment you suffer as Christ did." And Louis allowed it. He lay beneath the blade. A moment's silence. Then the executioner pulled the lever. The blade dropped. The king's head fell into the basket. A roar erupted from the square. A mixture of triumph, terror, and something else. Something like confusion, as if the people realized too late that they had crossed a threshold that could not be uncrossed. Blood pooled at the base of the scaffold. A few men rushed forward to dip handkerchiefs in it, hoping to keep a relic. Others turned away, sickened by what they had just cheered. The drummers stopped. The silence afterward was heavier than the execution itself. Louis XVI, by birth the embodiment of divine monarchy, had died not with grandeur, but with the dull thud of oak and steel. The execution did not end a reign. It ended an idea, that kings ruled by the grace of God and could not be judged by men. But now, the king had been judged, and France would never be the same. The prison door creaked open before sunrise. The sky above Paris was still dark, as if reluctant to witness what would unfold. Inside the temple, Louis sat quietly in the corner of his sparse cell, his hands clasped, lips moving in silent prayer. There was no crown, no throne, just a wooden chair, a thin blanket, and the echo of old power fading into the cold stone walls. He had known the verdict before they ever spoke it aloud. The trial had been theatre, the outcome inevitable, but something in him still hoped. Not for mercy, he had stopped believing in that, but for understanding, for some voice somewhere, to recognise that the man they now called Louis Capet had once been a father, a husband, and yes, a king who never imagined he would rule in the age of Rousseau and guillotines. Footsteps approached. 4 men entered. They did not bow. They informed him, with the practised flatness of bureaucrats, that it was time. He nodded once, slowly. He stood. He had refused the red shirt worn by traitors. He dressed instead in white, the colour of Bourbon innocence, or perhaps denial. His hands trembled as he buttoned his coat, but his face did not. He did not eat the breakfast they brought him. His appetite had long since vanished. He took 1 sip of water, then asked for the priest. Abbé Edgeworth entered and placed a trembling hand on Louis's shoulder. For a moment they were silent. Then Louis spoke. "I am ready," he said, though the words sounded less like conviction and more like ritual, something one says because it must be said. The guards led him out of the cell, down the hallway. past the rooms where his children once played, past the door behind which Marie Antoinette wept, forbidden to see him one last time. His family had been erased with as much efficiency as his crown. The halls of the temple prison were narrow and dim, but even there the sound of drums rolled faintly through the windows. A military procession had gathered outside. The cart waited. The moment Louis stepped into the cold morning air, he squinted, not against the light, but against the enormity of it all. He was no longer in a prison. He was now in history. The soldiers flanked him immediately, sabres drawn, faces unreadable. The cart itself was rough-hewn wood, built to carry the condemned across cobblestones. As Louis climbed aboard, the crowd stirred. Some spat, some crossed themselves. Most said nothing at all. A priest, a prisoner, and a nation in suspense, the journey had begun. And Paris watched. The cart lurched forward. It moved slowly, deliberately, like the grinding gears of fate itself. Louis swayed slightly with each bump, his hands gripping the sides of the cart, not from fear, but from instinct, as though his body still hoped to balance itself against a world that no longer offered balance. The streets were lined with soldiers, their bayonets raised like a metallic corridor guiding him to death. Beyond them, crowds had gathered, not thousands, tens of thousands, a river of faces stretching from the temple to the Place de la Révolution, each pair of eyes fixed on one solitary man. Some stared in silence, unsure of what they felt. Others shouted obscenities, the old slogans of the revolution, now spat like curses. And then there were those who watched with a strange reverent stillness. Men and women who had once cheered his coronation, who had once believed in monarchy, or who simply couldn't believe they were alive to see this moment. The king, no, the former king, passing by like a ghost already half vanished from the world. Louis did not avert his gaze. He looked out at the people, one street at a time, one face at a time. He saw rage, he saw fear, he saw the eyes of a people who had been broken by bread shortages and conscription and centuries of hierarchy. And somewhere in that mass of bodies and breath, perhaps he also saw his own failure, not as a tyrant, but as a man who had never truly understood the kingdom he was meant to lead. Beside him, Abbé Edgeworth whispered prayers. Louis listened. He nodded. But his mind was elsewhere now, already approaching the end. The guillotine rose into view long before the cart reached it, a skeletal silhouette against the grey January sky. Its blade shimmered slightly in the morning light, motionless but menacing. The scaffold itself had been raised high so that all could witness justice. Revolution demanded visibility. Dignity was a casualty. As they neared the Place de la Révolution, the crowd grew louder. Louder still. The beat of the drums was joined by murmurs, gasps, shouts. Louis, the traitor! Long live the Republic! But also, beneath it all, a kind of trembling awe. This wasn't just a moment, it was an undoing, a sacred inversion, a divine rite dismantled before breakfast. The cart stopped. 2 executioners stepped forward, their clothes stained from the morning's previous duties. They motioned to Louis. He stood slowly, carefully. Atop the scaffold, he turned to the priest. I am innocent, he said, and I die without fear. I forgive my enemies. His voice was calm, too calm. He tried to speak further, to address the crowd, but the drums began again, louder now, a wall of noise designed to drown his final words. He turned once more toward the people, but it was too late. History had already begun to erase him, even as it was still writing his last sentence. The executioners grabbed his arms. He resisted for only a moment, not from defiance but from reflex. Then he allowed them to bind his hands and lay him beneath the blade, one final breath, one final heartbeat. Above him, the guillotine held its silence for just a moment longer, and then the blade fell. The head fell into the basket, and with it centuries of monarchy collapsed in a single breathless instant. There was no thunderclap, no divine intervention, no miracle, just the soft thud of flesh on wood, the wet snap of finality. The body of Louis XVI remained for a moment on the scaffold, twitching slightly, blood pouring from the stump in rhythmic pulses. The executioners worked quickly. This was routine now. The King of France was not the first man they had killed that week. One of them held the severed head aloft. Blood dripped down his arm, soaked the cuff of his shirt. The crowd roared. It was not the spontaneous cry of relief or justice. It was practiced, conditioned, part of the theatre. Some cheered out of genuine revolutionary joy, others simply because everyone else was doing it. A few wept, a few fainted, but the collective body of France had crossed a threshold, and there was no returning. On a nearby building, a woman vomited into the street. Beneath the scaffold, blood pooled at the base of the steps, mixing with discarded pamphlets and crushed tricolour rosettes. The drums stopped. The roar subsided. The moment was over. But the silence it left behind was not peace. It was disorientation, as if the very air had forgotten how to breathe without a king in it. The crowd began to disperse, slowly at first, then in waves. People muttered to each other, repeated fragments of what they'd seen, like they needed to speak it aloud to believe it had happened. There were no fireworks, no celebrations, just a slow turning away. Back at the Temple prison, the Queen had felt it. Marie Antoinette did not know the precise hour, but the sudden hush through the corridors, the way the guards avoided her gaze, told her everything. She had known this day would come, perhaps not so soon, perhaps not like this, but in the end, the Republic had no use for a husbandless queen. She sat in silence, hands folded in her lap, staring at the wall. In the convention, the deputies celebrated their victory, not with wine or laughter, but with votes and legislation. The monarchy was now officially abolished. The man who had once been called Louis the Well-Beloved was now a legal non-entity. His name was stripped from the calendars, his seal removed from documents, his presence scrubbed from coins and prayers. Yet erasure was not so easy. Louis lived on, in the whispers of old men in the secret mass said behind shuttered windows, in the flicker of doubt that passed across Robespierre's face when he spoke of virtue and necessity in the same breath. The execution had ended a life, but it had not resolved the question of power. It had only sharpened it. For some, Louis became a martyr. For others, a tyrant who got what he deserved. But for most, he was something stranger, a ghost, a hollowed figure still looming in the minds of those who had grown up kissing his image in catechism books or watching his carriage roll through the streets with golden wheels. He had been everything. Now he was nothing. And in that nothing, the revolution stared back at itself and asked what it had truly become. Children played in the alleys beneath the guillotine that night, using the empty scaffold as a stage. They reenacted the execution with sticks and laughter. One played the king, another the blade. They had never known anything else. And above it all, the moon hung low over Paris, indifferent, watching as a kingdom bled itself into a republic. Watching as a crown, still glinting with the blood of its wearer, lay forgotten in a corner of history, headless, but not yet buried. The silence didn't last, as the executioners scrubbed blood from the scaffold, and Parisians returned to their breadlines. The shock of Louis XVI's death rippled far beyond the Place de la Révolution. Across Europe, palaces shook, not from cannon fire, but from something colder, the realization that divine right had been severed by steel. In Vienna, Emperor Francis II received the news with a clenched jaw. Louis had been his brother-in-law, a fellow monarch, a man of the same divine order. Now he was headless. The fate of kings was suddenly no longer in God's hands, but in the hands of common men, wielding ideology like a blade. It wasn't just a king who had died in Paris. It was the very idea that kings were untouchable. Catherine the Great in Russia called it a monstrous crime. She tightened her grip on dissent with renewed urgency, ensuring that revolutionary thoughts never took root in her soil. In London, George III watched uneasily from behind the walls of Windsor, his ministers whispering of unrest, of radicals, of pamphlets smuggled across the Channel. Britain had executed kings before, but this was different. This was not a civil war. This was something contagious. The monarchies of Europe, once a fraternity of silken gloves and quiet treaties, now looked at France with revulsion and dread. They saw a country devouring its own sovereign, and they realized it might one day come for theirs. Diplomacy turned to steel. War brewed on every horizon. But it wasn't only kings who heard the echo. In coffee houses and salons, in shipyards and slums, the people of Europe watched with a different kind of awe. For the poor and the voiceless, the execution was not horror. It was a kind of twisted hope. The spectacle of revolution gave them a vision of what might be possible. A world where a crown did not place a man above justice, where bloodlines were not destiny, and where the mighty could be made to kneel. Poets wrote verses in secret. Artists sketched guillotines in the margins of their journals. And revolutionaries, real and imagined, whispered the name of Louis Capet, not as a king, but as a corpse. Proof that the old world was not invincible. And yet the tremors of Louis's death also reached those who had once supported the revolution. Men who had cheered in the early days now found themselves staring at the guillotine with unease. Was this the end they had dreamed of? Was liberty supposed to look like this? Red with blood and deaf with cheering? The streets of Paris, still slick from rain and execution, began to harden with new divisions. The radical grew more radical, the moderate more silent. The echo of the king's death did not fade. It grew louder, rebounding through the chambers of government and the catacombs of thought. It asked questions that no one was ready to answer. Who was next? How much blood was enough? Louis XVI was gone, but his ghost remained, not haunting the palace, but haunting the conscience of a revolution that now had to decide whether it had killed a tyrant or birthed something worse. If this story left you stunned, disturbed, or simply more curious about the fragile edge between power and collapse, give the video a like. And if you want more brutal, beautiful, and forgotten moments from history, don't forget to subscribe. There's so much more to uncover.